When you look at the architecture of a maximum security fortress, like, your first instinct is usually just to look at the walls.
Right, the physical structure.
Exactly. You see the reinforced concrete, the guard towers, the heavy iron gates.
Yeah.
And you immediately think about how oppressive it all is for anyone who's trapped inside.
Yeah, which makes sense. That's the immediate visual.
Right. But if you talk to the architect of that fortress, they'll tell you something completely different. They'll tell you that every single brutal, oppressive feature of that building, every block of it, wasn't originally designed to keep people in.
Okay.
It was meticulously engineered out of sheer paranoia to keep a very specific set of monsters out.
That is wow. We so rarely apply that kind of architectural logic to geopolitical structures. When we look at modern nation states, especially those with really severe internal controls, the question usually just stops at the oppression itself.
Yeah.
We rarely trace the blueprints back to find out, who the monsters were that forced the walls to be built in the first place.
And that is exactly the analytical lens we are applying to our source material for today's deep dive. We are looking at Iran. And I want to welcome you, the listener, to this journey, because this is one of the most complex geopolitical puzzles out there.
It really is.
Because if you ask an observer in the West to visualize Iran today, the mental reel of footage is incredibly consistent.
Right, it's the 1979 hostage crisis.
Exactly. You see that. You see sweeping crackdowns by the morality police. You see mass protests in the streets of Tehran. And of course, you see this unyielding, fiercely anti-Western religious regime that has dominated the country for, over 4 decades now?
Yeah, over 40 years. And the prevailing narrative usually assumes that the entire story is just religion, just this isolated bubble of ideological zealotry.
Right. But our mission today, looking at the sources, is to dig deeper.
Much deeper. The thesis here from the source material is that the modern Iranian state, this fortress you mentioned, is a direct engineered response to 200 years of absolute humiliation.
200 years.
Yeah. 200 years of economic exploitation, foreign intervention, just constant trauma. To understand the survival mechanics of the current regime, we really have to look past the religious veil and examine that historical trauma that built it.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand this, we have to go back to a time before the humiliation. Before the 1800s, Iran, or Persia as it was known to outsiders back then, wasn't a pawn on a global chessboard. It was the chess master.
Right. It was an advanced civilizational superpower. They had ruled these vast expanses of the Middle East and Central Asia for over 2,000 years.
But then we hit the turn of the 19th century.
Right. Under the Qajar dynasty.
Yeah, the Qajar dynasty. And that civilizational dominance just evaporates. The empire finds itself caught in this geographic vice grip between two aggressively ambitious global powers.
Yeah, the classic rock and a hard place. So to the north, you have the Russian Empire expanding. And Russia's eternal geographic curse has always been its lack of warm water ports.
Right, because their northern ports freeze over in the winter.
Exactly, which completely cripples their naval and merchant fleets for months out of the year. So they looked south toward the land between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea.
Which was territory controlled by the Qajar dynasty at the time.
Yep. And the Russians didn't negotiate. They just initiated a series of brutal military campaigns. And this resulted in the treaties of Golistan in 1813 and Turkmenchay in 1828.
And these treaties, they didn't just cede territory in the Caucasus, right? It wasn't just drawing new lines on a map.
No, not at all. The specific legal mechanisms embedded in these documents, they systematically dismantled Iranian sovereignty.
How so? What were the actual mechanics of that?
Well, first, the treaties forced Iran to pay these massive war indemnities. It essentially bankrupted the Qajar treasury overnight.
Just totally drained the bank.
Completely. And furthermore, they granted Russia exclusive military control over the Caspian Sea. But, and this is crucial, the most insidious element was the introduction of what they called capitulations.
Capitulations.
Okay. Yeah. This was a legal framework that demanded that Russian merchants and citizens operating inside Iran be completely exempt from Iranian law.
I really want to unpack the mechanics of that extraterritoriality, because this isn't just a historical footnote.
No, it's a massive psychological blow.
Right. Because if a Russian merchant, say, commits a crime in Tehran or defaults on a debt to an Iranian businessman, the Iranian police cannot arrest him.
No.
The Iranian courts cannot try him. He can only be judged by a Russian consular court. It is the absolute degradation of a state's monopoly on law and order.
Exactly. It signals to the Iranian populace that their laws are subordinate, And by extension, it implies their entire culture is inferior.
That legal subservience, I mean, that sets a psychological precedent that would just burn in the Iranian consciousness for centuries.
Oh, absolutely. It festered. And while Russia is locking down the north, you have the British Empire watching from the south and east with mounting paranoia.
Right, because just east of Iran was India.
The crown jewel of the British Empire?
Exactly. And the British saw Iran as this indispensable buffer zone. Like, if Russia continued its push south and gained access to the Persian Gulf, that directly threatened British India.
Yeah, the British military establishment openly referred to the land east of Iran as the key to India. They viewed Russia as a highly dangerous neighbor that just had to be contained at all costs.
But the British strategy wasn't outright conquest, was it?
No, no. Iran's mountainous geography and just its massive land area made it far too expensive to garrison. Like, you couldn't just occupy it easily.
So what did they do?
Their strategy was remote control. They needed the Iranian government to be just strong enough to keep the Russians out, but weak enough to remain completely subservient to London.
It's like, imagine Iran as this crucial piece of high ground on a monopoly board, right?
Okay, I like that.
And neither player actually wants to build houses or hotels on it.
Yeah.
They just desperately want to keep it away from the other player.
That's a perfect analogy, yes.
But how does an Iranian king survive this? I mean, why not just fight back against both of them?
Well, the Qajar Shahs found themselves in an impossible position. Like I said, they were bankrupt from Russian war debts. And they're squeezed by two industrialized militaries. To keep the state afloat, they resorted to selling economic concessions.
Economic concessions, which sounds like normal trade, but it's not.
Not at all. This wasn't trade. This was the wholesale auctioning of the nation's infrastructure. The Shah would grant foreign companies monopolistic control over Iranian industries in exchange for just, like, immediate cash payments.
So, wait. I want to push back on the framing of this slightly, just playing devil's advocate based on the sources.
Sure.
Because looking at the records from the 1800s, British and Russian capital was responsible for building Iran's first telegraph lines, establishing its modern banking system, laying the groundwork for real infrastructure.
That is true, yes.
So surely the infusion of European capital brought some modernization and economic benefit to the Iranian middle class, right? Even if the terms were colonial.
Well, the infrastructure was built, yes, but the economic model was purely extractive.
Extractive.
Yeah. Take the Indo-European telegraph line built by the British. It modernized communications, sure, but its primary function was to connect London to India. It wasn't built to serve the Iranian populace.
Ah, I see.
And then look at the Reuter concession in 1872. A British subject, Paul Julius Reuter, was granted, and this is wild, the Shah literally gave him exclusive rights to build all railways, operate all streetcars, exploit all minerals, and manage the National Bank and Customs.
Wait, all of it? Just to one guy?
To one guy. Even British diplomats at the time called it the most complete and extraordinary surrender of the entire industrial resources of a kingdom into foreign hands.
That's insane.
And the profits all flowed outward. The tolls, the banking fees, the raw materials, none of it enriched the Iranian state. It enriched foreign shareholders, while the Shah used his meager cut to fund lavish European vacations.
Wow. So I want you, the listener, to just imagine your own country right now. Imagine if your roads, your banks, your entire telecommunications network were entirely owned and operated by foreign rivals who pocketed all the profits and took them out of the country.
It would be intolerable.
Exactly. That dynamic created an unbearable pressure cooker. The Iranian people, who were heirs to a 2,000-year legacy of empire, were suddenly reduced to tenants in their own home.
And the breaking point finally arrived. But interestingly, it wasn't over the railways or the banks.
No.
No, it was over something deeply ingrained in the daily cultural fabric of the society. In 1890, the Shah granted a 50-year concession to a British major named G.F. Talbot.
Okay. What was the concession for?
For a lump sum, Talbot gained an absolute monopoly over the production, sale, and export of all Iranian tobacco.
Oh, wow. Tobacco.
Yes. Every single farmer who grew tobacco had to sell it to the British company, and every merchant had to buy it from them.
The mechanics of enforcing that kind of monopoly across a highly decentralized mountainous country, I mean, that must have been incredibly invasive.
Oh, it was. British agents were suddenly dictating terms in every local bazaar.
And this hit a cultural nerve.
A massive one. This sparked the tobacco protest of 1890. And it wasn't just isolated discontent, It was a massive, unified mobilization orchestrated by the clergy, the merchants, and the secular intellectuals all working together.
Because it affected everyone.
Exactly. A prominent cleric actually issued a fatwa banning the use of tobacco as long as the British controlled it.
And people actually listened to the fatwa.
It was universally observed. I mean, even the women in the Shah's own harem stopped smoking.
Wait, really? His own harem?
Yes. The financial loss and just the sheer scale of the civil disobedience forced the Shah to completely cancel the concession.
That is amazing. So it worked.
It worked. The tobacco protest was really the first time the Iranian public realized that their collective mobilization could overpower the corruption of their monarch and the economic imperialism of the West.
And that momentum fed directly into the constitutional revolution of 1905, didn't it?
It did. The Iranian people demanded a parliament, a constitution, and strict legal limits on the Shah's ability to sell the country to foreigners.
And they actually achieved it for a minute, right? They temporarily established a constitutional monarchy.
They did, but the Russian Empire was terrified that a democratic, accountable Iran would put an end to their lucrative concessions, so they intervened.
Right. And this is where it gets really brutal.
In 1908, with the blessing of the new Shah, who completely despised the limits on his power, the Russian-officered Persian Cossack Brigade literally marched on the newly established parliament.
The parliament they just fought to build.
Yes, they rolled cannons up to the building and bombarded the symbol of Iranian democracy. Hundreds of constitutionalists were killed, arrested, or executed.
God, that's heartbreaking. So the democratic spirit is bruised, obviously. But the geopolitical board is about to be violently flipped again, right?
Oh, yeah, by a discovery in the southern province of Khuzestan.
Because in 1901, the Shah had sold yet another concession, this time to an English millionaire named William Knox Darcy. And this granted him exclusive rights to prospect for oil across most of the country. And for 7 years, Darcy found absolutely nothing. He was basically on the verge of bankruptcy.
He was ready to pack it in.
But then, in 1908, his engineers strike massive, world-shifting reserves of oil at Masjid Soliman.
And I want to emphasize how the timing of that discovery fundamentally altered world history.
How so?
Up until this moment, the British Navy, which was the absolute backbone of global British supremacy, ran entirely on coal.
Right.
But the First Lord of the Admiralty at the time, Winston Churchill, recognized that shifting the fleet to oil would make the ships faster, require less manpower, and provide this massive tactical advantage over the Germans.
So the discovery of oil literally transformed Iran from a convenient buffer state into the single most vital piece of strategic real estate on the planet for the British Empire.
Exactly. Because whoever controlled Iranian oil controlled the British Navy. The Darcy concession gave break to the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which we know today as BP, British Petroleum.
Oh, wow, that's BP's origin.
That's BP. And in 1914, just before the outbreak of World War I, the British government quietly bought a controlling 51% stake in the company.
So Iran's primary resource was no longer just owned by a foreign company. It was legally controlled by the British state itself.
Precisely. And that guaranteed that Britain would never, ever willingly leave Iran.
Man. So then the First World War breaks out, and Iran's parliament officially declares neutrality. Like, they want absolutely no part in this European slaughter.
Right, they try to stay out of it.
But the strategic reality of the oil fields and just the geographic reality of Iran's borders with the Russian and Ottoman empires made neutrality impossible.
Totally impossible. The warring empires just dragged the conflict directly into Iranian territory. You had British, Russian, and Ottoman forces crisscrossing the country, fighting battles, requisitioning grain, and destroying local infrastructure.
And the result of that was the Persian famine of 1917 to 1919. And I really want to highlight the tragedy of this because the mechanics of that famine are devastating. You have foreign armies confiscating the local harvest to feed their own troops.
Leaving nothing for the Iranians.
Right, and global trade blockades are preventing imports. Then, disease outbreaks like cholera and influenza sweep through this completely weakened population.
The mortality estimates are just staggering.
They really are. The sources suggest that up to 2 million Iranians, which was perhaps a quarter of the population in the north, died.
A quarter of the population.
2 million people. And it was a demographic catastrophe for a country that wasn't even formally in the war.
It's unfathomable. But out of the ashes of that devastation, the geopolitical landscape shifts again. The Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 forces Russia to temporarily retreat from its imperial ambitions.
So the British Empire is left as the sole dominant power in Iran.
Right. And the Iranian state is functionally collapsed at this point. The government is incredibly weak, the people are traumatized, and into this power vacuum steps a military officer from the Cossack Brigade named Reza Khan, who would soon crown himself Reza Shah.
Reza Shah. Now, he is one of the most complex state builders of the 20th century.
Very complex.
He engineers a coup in 1921, systematically consolidates power, completely ousts the Qajar dynasty, and declares himself the new monarch.
Right. And his mandate was fiercely nationalistic. He looked at the absolute ruin of his country and decided the only way to prevent foreign exploitation was through rapid, aggressive modernization.
So he implemented this top-down authoritarian overhaul of the state.
Yes. He built secular courts to intentionally sideline the religious clergy. He established the first modern university. He constructed the massive Trans-Iranian Railway,
Which was a huge deal.
a huge infrastructure project.
Yeah.
He also forced nomadic tribes to settle, mandated Western dress, and in 1936 he controversially banned women from wearing the veil in public.
And didn't he also push for the use of Farsi over Arabic?
He did. He was highly focused on Persian identity. He actually demanded that the international community stop using the colonial label Persia and refer to the country by its native name, Iran.
Okay, so I hear all this, and it sounds like a golden era of independence and growth. Like he's building railways, creating universities, asserting national pride.
Right.
Where does it go wrong? Why doesn't this solve the foreign intervention problem once and for all?
Well, I look at the Trans-Iranian Railway as the perfect physical manifestation of his strategy and his ultimate flaw. He intentionally routed that railway from the Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf, completely bypassing the major commercial centers that the British and Russians wanted connected.
Oh, that's smart.
Yeah, and it was financed entirely by domestic taxes on tea and sugar, so he completely avoided foreign debt.
Impressive.
But his strategy had a fatal geopolitical flaw. In his desperation to find technical expertise that wasn't British or Russian, he brought in thousands of German engineers and technicians.
German engineers in the 1930s.
Exactly. By the late 1930s, Germany was Iran's biggest trading partner.
And then World War II breaks out.
Right. And suddenly, the presence of German nationals running the railways and communications networks in Iran becomes an intolerable threat to the Allies.
Because the British desperately needed the Anglo-Persian oil fields to fuel their fight against Hitler.
And the Soviet Union, which was now facing the Nazi invasion on the Eastern Front, desperately needed a secure supply route.
And that Trans-Iranian Railway was the perfect conduit for the Allies to ship weapons and supplies into Russia.
Exactly. So Britain and the Soviet Union issue an ultimatum to Reza Shah: expel the Germans immediately.
And what did the Shah do?
Well, Reza Shah, trying to defend his hard-won sovereignty, attempted to play them off each other. He tried to stall and claim neutrality again.
But the empires had no patience for that.
None. In August 1941, Britain and the Soviet Union launched a massive, coordinated invasion of Iran. They decimated the Iranian military in a matter of days.
Days, wow.
Yeah. They forced Reza Shah to abdicate, and they exiled him to South Africa.
Just completely tossed him out. So all of his modernization, his fierce nationalism, his infrastructure, literally none of it mattered in the end.
None of it. The country was violently occupied, partitioned, and utilized simply as a logistical corridor and a gas station for the Allied war effort.
And to ensure compliance, the British and Soviets placed Reza Shah's 22-year-old son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, on the throne.
Right. And this new young Shah was intensely aware that he did not earn his crown. It was handed to him by the occupying forces.
He was just a compliant puppet.
Essentially, he was inexperienced and lacked any real domestic legitimacy. And as World War II ended and the Allied troops eventually withdrew, they left behind an Iranian populace that was politically awakened and deeply, deeply resentful.
Because the British decolonized elsewhere after the war, right, like in India.
Yeah.
But they completely refused to let go of Iranian oil.
Yes. The defining issue of the post-war era became the oil. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company was extracting millions of barrels of wealth, but the financial arrangement was staggeringly unequal.
How unequal are we talking?
Under the legacy of the old Darcy concession, Iran was receiving roughly 16% of the profits from its own oil.
16%. That is an absolute insult.
And the insult wasn't just financial, It was operational. The oil company operated its massive refinery in Abadan, like a literal colonial enclave.
How so?
British managers lived in these pristine neighborhoods with manicured lawns, swimming pools, tennis courts, while the Iranian laborers who actually worked the rigs lived in squalid slums without basic sanitation or running water.
That grotesque inequality. I mean, you can see why the Iranian people decided enough was enough.
Exactly. So the Iranian parliament, seeking to renegotiate, asked for a 50-50 profit split, which, by the way, was a model that American oil companies were already implementing in places like Saudi Arabia and Venezuela.
It was the industry standard at that point.
It was. But the British establishment was deeply entrenched in an imperial mindset. They viewed the oil as British property discovered by British ingenuity.
So they refused.
They offered very minor financial concessions, but absolutely refused to surrender operational control or agree to the 50-50 split.
And the Iranian prime minister at the time, he was actually willing to accept that compromise, right?
He was, but he was assassinated by a nationalist for even entertaining it.
Wow. And into this incredibly volatile atmosphere sips a man named Mohammad Mossadegh.
Yes, Mossadegh is such a crucial figure. He was an aristocratic, highly educated, fiercely nationalistic politician.
But he wasn't a religious fundamentalist, right?
Not at all. He was a secular Democrat. He rallied the parliament with a simple, unassailable argument. Political independence is impossible without economic independence.
That makes total sense.
So in 1951, the Iranian parliament voted to nationalize the entire oil industry, and they elected Mossadegh as prime minister to execute it.
So, I often look at this and question whether Mossadegh was almost too politically rigid. Like, by nationalizing the industry outright, he effectively seized British assets. Did he miscalculate the severity of the British response? Or did he genuinely believe the international community, maybe the U.S., would back his play for sovereignty?
That's a great question. Mossadegh fundamentally misread the global dynamic. He believed the era of overt imperialism was over. He actually traveled to the United Nations and The Hague to argue his case, relying purely on international law.
And did the U.S. support him?
Initially, the United States sympathized with him, viewing the British as stubborn colonialists. But the British didn't rely on the courts to win this fight. They relied on economic strangulation.
Right. The blockade.
Yes. The British government orchestrated the blockade completely devastated the Iranian economy. Government revenues just collapsed overnight. But Mossadegh refused to yield. And the Iranian people bore the economic hardship as the price of sovereignty.
But Britain eventually realizes they can't just starve Mossadegh out, right?
Right. They realized they needed to overthrow him. But post-war Britain lacked the covert capability and the funds to pull off a regime change alone.
So they needed the United States.
Exactly. Now, the Truman administration had refused to help the British overthrow a democratic leader just to save a British oil monopoly.
Truman said no.
He did. But in 1953, Dwight D. Eisenhower takes office, and he brings with him Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and his brother, CIA Director Allen Dulles.
The Dulles brothers.
Yep. And the British intelligence service, MI6, recognized they had a new, much more receptive audience, so they changed their pitch.
How did they pitch it to the CIA?
MI6 completely stopped talking about oil revenues and started talking about the Cold War. They presented intelligence to the CIA, arguing that Mossadegh's economic crisis was creating dangerous instability.
The crisis that Britain caused.
Exactly. But they warned that the Communist Tudeh party in Iran was gaining ground because of it. And they argued that if Mossadegh fell, Iran and its massive oil reserves would slip behind the Iron Curtain into Soviet hands.
Wow. That is a bureaucratic masterstroke by the British.
It really was, because the CIA wasn't going to fight a corporate war for British petroleum, but they were absolutely willing to fight a proxy war against the Soviet Union.
So President Eisenhower approves the operation.
He does. It was codenamed Operation Ajax.
Operation Ajax. And honestly, the mechanics of this coup, looking at the sources, it reads exactly like a meticulously planned heist movie.
It really does.
You have the CIA's Middle East guy, Kermit Roosevelt, acting as the mastermind on the ground in Tehran. Let's break down this heist because it's fascinating.
Okay, let's do it. So Roosevelt arrived in Iran with a budget that eventually reached the equivalent of tens of millions of dollars in cash.
Just bags of cash.
Literally. His objective was to manufacture a crisis that would justify the young Shah legally dismissing Mossadegh. The operation utilized a network of Iranian intelligence assets, military officers, and politicians who had already been cultivated by MI6.
So they had the inside connections. And the distraction phase of the heist involved a massive psychological warfare campaign, right?
Yes. Roosevelt's agents aggressively bribed newspaper editors to publish fake articles accusing Mossadegh of corruption, treason, and anti-Islamic behavior.
Fake news, literally.
Literal fake news. They also paid religious clerics to denounce him in their Friday sermons.
And then came the street theater part of the operation.
Right. The CIA literally paid gang leaders from the bazaars to organize violent protests. They funded fake communist rallies where paid thugs would smash shop windows and attack religious symbols in the name of Mossadegh.
Just to frame him.
Exactly. It terrified the conservative middle class and the clergy into believing a violent communist takeover was imminent.
It's just so deeply cynical.
Yeah.
So who was the inside man for the new government?
The inside man was General Fazlollah Zahedi. He was a former interior minister who the CIA selected to replace Mossadegh. But the initial plan relied on a legal fiction.
Right, they drafted a royal decree.
Yes, the CIA drafted a decree dismissing Mossadegh and pressured the young Shah to sign it. In August 1953, the Shah's Imperial Guard delivered the decree to Mossadegh's house.
But Mossadegh was ready for them.
He had been tipped off. So he arrested the messenger, went on the national radio, and announced to the country that he had just thwarted a foreign-backed military coup.
Oh, man. So what did the Shah do?
The Shah absolutely panicked and immediately fled the country, first to Baghdad and then to Rome.
So the operation seemed like a total failure at that point.
It did. The CIA headquarters in Washington actually cabled Roosevelt in Tehran and ordered him to abandon the mission and leave Iran immediately.
But Roosevelt ignored a direct order from Washington.
He did. He decided to pivot from a pseudo-legal dismissal to a brute force military strike. He utilized his remaining funds to unleash the paid mobs back into the streets, creating absolute, uncontrollable chaos.
And simultaneously, the CIA is leveraging its contacts within the Iranian military.
Right, convincing key commanders that Mossadegh was leading the country into anarchy and communism.
And then, on August 19th, the military moves.
Tanks rolled through the streets of Tehran. The military and the paid mobs converged on Mossadegh's residence. There was a violent siege, a tank battle, essentially, that left hundreds of people dead, and finally Mossadegh surrendered.
That is just wow. And what happened to him?
He was tried by a military tribunal, found guilty of treason, and spent the rest of his life under house arrest.
And the Shah.
The CIA and MI6 flew the young Shah back from Rome and reinstalled him on the peacock throne. But this time, with absolute dictatorial power, the democratic trajectory of Iran was just completely shattered.
And as a final transaction, this is the kicker, the newly formed International Oil Consortium gave American companies a 40% share of Iran's oil.
Yep. Breaking the British monopoly as a direct reward for the CIA's intervention.
So for the Iranian populace, 1953 wasn't just a political defeat. It was this profound, lasting psychological trauma.
Absolutely. Because the West, which was constantly preaching the virtues of democracy and self-determination on the global stage, had just systematically destroyed the first truly democratic nationalist government in the Middle East.
And simply to maintain control over resources.
Exactly.
So the era that follows from the 1950s through the late 1970s, I look at this as the era of the puppet's golden cage. Because the Shah understood perfectly well that his domestic legitimacy was non-existent.
He knew he didn't have the support of the people. His power was derived entirely from Washington and London.
So how does he rule? I mean, how do you stabilize a regime like that?
Well, the Shah embarked on an aggressive, top-down modernization program called the White Revolution.
The White Revolution. Why white?
The term white was used explicitly to contrast it with a red communist revolution. It was designed to preempt social unrest by forcefully modernizing the economy from above.
Okay, so what did that involve?
He granted women the right to vote, heavily funded secular education in rural areas, and initiated a massive land reform program.
Now, the mechanics of that land reform are critical. Because, on paper, breaking up the massive estates of the absentee landlords and the religious clergy to give land back to the peasant farmers, that sounds incredibly progressive.
On paper, yes, but the execution was disastrous.
Why? What happened?
The peasants were given plots of land that were just way too small to be economically viable, and they lacked access to the water rights, the seeds, and the capital that the wealthy landlords used to provide.
So they couldn't actually farm it successfully?
No. Millions of rural farmers went bankrupt. They abandoned their land and migrated to the cities looking for work.
And that created a huge demographic shift.
Exactly. They formed these massive, deeply impoverished slums on the outskirts of Tehran. It created a deeply resentful, highly conservative underclass right at the doorstep of the regime.
And as this social crisis is expanding, The Shah doesn't respond with political reform or aid, right? He responds with severe repression.
Yes. Because he couldn't rely on the consent of the governed, he had to rely on an architecture of terror. With the direct assistance of the CIA and Israel's intelligence agency, Mossad, the Shah established SAVAK.
SAVAK, the secret police.
Yes, and their methods of control were highly sophisticated. It wasn't just physical torture and black sites, though, let's be clear. That was rampant and horrific.
Right.
But Mossad trained SAVAK in the psychological mechanics of an omnipresent surveillance state. They infiltrated universities, trade unions, and civil service departments.
So you just never knew who was watching.
Exactly. The goal was to create a society where you couldn't trust your neighbor, your colleague, or even your own family members. All political opposition, from secular Marxists to moderate Democrats, was systematically hunted down and eliminated.
And that resentment was compounded by a profound national humiliation in 1964, wasn't it?
Yes. The Shah signed a status of forces agreement with the United States.
And this granted American military personnel and their dependents complete diplomatic immunity from Iranian laws.
It was the capitulations of the 1800s all over again.
Exactly. If an American soldier committed a crime against an Iranian, the Iranian courts were completely powerless.
It was a glaring daily reminder that the Shah was basically just a viceroy for a foreign power.
And the wealth disparity during the 1970s oil boom pushed the society to the absolute breaking point.
Yeah.
Because the Shah was floating on billions of dollars in new oil revenue, and he spent it on massive military hardware and just grotesque displays of personal opulence.
Oh, the opulence was staggering. In 1971, he spent an estimated $100 million on a single party in the desert.
$100 million in 1971 money.
Yes, to celebrate 2,500 years of the Persian Empire. He literally flew in millions of dollars of French cuisine served on Limoges porcelain to foreign dignitaries while completely ignoring the slums surrounding his own capital.
It's just tone deaf on a historical scale. So the political ecosystem had been completely sterilized of moderate opposition by SAVAK.
Right. The secular intellectuals and the Democratic parties were crushed.
So the only network that still possessed the infrastructure to organize any kind of mass movement was the religious clergy operating out of the mosques.
Because SAVAK couldn't completely shut down the mosques without causing an immediate holy war.
Right. And the match that ignited this powder keg was a conservative Shia cleric named Ruhollah Khomeini.
Yes.
Now, the Western historical lens often portrays Khomeini purely as a religious zealot who just wanted to drag Iran back to the Middle Ages.
Right, that's the caricature.
But examining his rhetoric from this era reveals a masterclass in political synthesis. He didn't just preach theology. He weaponized those 150 years of anti-imperialist trauma.
He absolutely did. Khomeini adopted a concept called garbzadegi, which translates roughly to restoxification.
Restoxification.
Yeah. He argued that Iran was suffering from an ideological disease, an infection of Western imperialism that was rotting the culture from the inside out. He pointed directly to that 1964 immunity law and declared, and this is a quote, "The government has sold our independence. They have reduced the Iranian people to a level lower than an American dog."
That is incredibly potent rhetoric. His brilliance really lay in his ability to fuse the deeply ingrained Shia Islamic tradition of martyrdom. You know, the righteous struggle of the oppressed against a corrupt tyrant with the global, Marxist-tinged, third world anti-colonial rhetoric of the 1960s.
It was a perfect storm of messaging.
Right. He appealed to the religious conservatives, but he also provided a framework that secular leftists and students could temporarily align with, because they all shared the exact same target, the Shah.
Exactly. Now, the Shah had recognized Khomeini's threat early on and forced him into exile in 1964.
But exile proved to be a tactical advantage for Khomeini.
It really did. Operating first from Iraq and later from France, Khomeini bypassed the Shah's absolute monopoly on state television and radio using a remarkably low-tech mechanism.
The cassette tape.
The cassette tape.
I mean, the cassette tape revolution is one of the most effective examples of asymmetric information warfare in history.
It's brilliant in its simplicity. Khomeini would record his fiery anti-imperial sermons in exile. These tapes were then smuggled into Iran by the thousands.
And local networks would just duplicate them on standard home stereos.
Right, and distribute them through the bazaar and mosques. So while the Shah was projecting this image of unassailable military strength on state TV, Khomeini's voice was directly in the ears of the working class.
By 1978, the mass mobilization became uncontainable. The protests that erupted were not just religious, they were this vast cross-societal coalition.
Yeah, you had the Bazaar merchants who felt marginalized by foreign imports. You had university students demanding free speech. You had the urban poor living in the slums, and of course the traditional clergy.
And the Shah attempted to crush the movement with military force.
Which backfired terribly.
On September 8, 1978, a day known as Black Friday, the military opened fire on protesters in Jalous Square in Tehran, killing dozens, possibly hundreds of people.
But instead of terrifying the public into submission, the massacre fractured the military's own morale and completely solidified the resolve of the protesters.
Because the mechanism of state failure ultimately wasn't a military defeat, was it?
No, it was economic paralysis. In late 1978, the Iranian oil workers went on a nationwide strike. By shutting down the refineries and stopping the export of oil, they completely cut off the financial oxygen of the regime. The state bureaucracy just crumbled.
So in January 1979, the Shah realizes that his American backers cannot save him from his own population. He boards an airplane and flees the country, claiming he was going on vacation.
But he would never return.
Never. And 2 weeks later, Ayatollah Khomeini flies into Tehran, greeted by a crowd of millions. The revolution had actually succeeded in tearing down the fortress of foreign influence.
But here's the crux of the modern state. Khomeini was a student of history. He looked back at 1953.
The Mossadegh coup.
Exactly. He remembered exactly how Mossadegh had been overthrown. Mossadegh had failed because he left the military structure intact, and the CIA used that very structure against him.
Right.
Khomeini was absolutely terrified that the United States would simply bribe a few generals, orchestrate another coup, and steal the country back.
So he set out to build an architecture of paranoia. He designed a government specifically engineered to be completely and permanently coup-proof. And the system he built, the one that still governs Iran today, is one of the most complex, overlapping political structures in the world.
It's dizzying. So on the surface, the Islamic Republic contains the mechanics of a democracy. There is an elected parliament, an elected president, and an elected body called the Assembly of Experts.
But the reality is a filtered democracy.
Highly filtered. Because above all the elected officials sits the supreme leader. And the supreme leader appoints half of the Guardian Council, which is a deeply conservative religious body.
And the Guardian Council exercises what they call approbative supervision.
Right.
Which isn't just the power to veto legislation, it is the power to disqualify any candidate from even running for office. If a politician's loyalty to the revolutionary ideology is even slightly questionable, they are barred from the ballot.
So the democracy only exists within a hermetically sealed ideological bubble.
Exactly. But political control wasn't enough for Khomeini.
No. Khomeini knew the real threat of a coup comes from the men with the guns. He couldn't disband the national army because Iran was facing threats, especially the impending war with Iraq, but he didn't trust them.
So what did he do?
He built a parallel military. In 1979, he created the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or the IRGC.
You know, I often question the efficacy of having two completely separate militaries. It just seems like a logistical nightmare.
It is a logistical nightmare.
But the structural logic isn't about efficiency. It's about survival. The regular army exists to defend the borders of the nation. The IRGC exists solely to defend the regime?
Precisely. The IRGC operates as a completely self-contained Leviathan. They have their own ground forces, they have their own navy, which operates primarily in the Persian Gulf, and they have their own aerospace program.
And they also control the Basij, right?
Yes. The Basij is a massive, decentralized volunteer militia embedded in literally every neighborhood, university, and factory. They are the eyes, ears, and enforcers of the regime's morality laws, designed to crush domestic uprisings before they can even organize.
And the IRGC's influence extends far beyond just the military. They have grown into this massive economic conglomerate.
Oh, it's huge. Through construction firms like Khatam al-Anbiya, they control vast sectors of the Iranian economy, infrastructure, telecommunications, energy.
Which means by intertwining the military with the economy, the regime ensures that any attempt to dismantle the IRGC would just collapse the entire state infrastructure.
Exactly, it's a poison pill. But the paranoia doesn't stop at the borders.
No, it doesn't.
The regime developed a highly classified wing of the IRGC called the Quds Force, which is dedicated entirely to extraterritorial operations. Their strategic logic is asymmetric forward defense.
Which basically means if we fight our enemies in Lebanon or Syria or Iraq or Yemen, We don't have to fight them on the streets of Tehran.
Right. The Quads force arms, trains, and funds proxy militias across the Middle East. They are deliberately exporting chaos to create a massive, unstable buffer zone between Iran and the Western military bases surrounding it.
Which leads us to the ultimate manifestation of this defensive posture. The regime looked at the geopolitical landscape. They looked at what happened to nations like Iraq or Libya that lacked a nuclear deterrent, and they drew a very chilling conclusion.
Yes. If you truly want to ensure that Western empires never invade you, never dictate your laws, and never overthrow your government again, a conventional military just isn't enough.
You need the bomb.
You need the bomb.
The decades-long pursuit of nuclear weapons capability is not some wild anomaly. It is the logical endpoint of their architectural design. It is the final, unassailable wall of the fortress, the ultimate insurance policy against a repeat of 1941 or 1953.
Now, we must be absolutely clear on our analytical framework here.
Yes, definitely.
By mapping out the historical trauma and the structural logic behind the Guardian Council, the IRGC, the proxy network, and the nuclear program, we are strictly analyzing statecraft. Understanding the mechanics of a regime's survival strategy is not a moral justification for its actions.
Absolutely not. We are just analyzing the blueprints. We are explaining why decades of Western economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and covert sabotage have failed to collapse the system. The system was meticulously engineered from its very inception to absorb exactly that kind of pressure.
But the most tragic dimension of this entire 200-year saga, the part that really hurts to look at, is the collateral damage.
Yeah.
We have spent the last hour discussing empires, czars, shahs, intelligence agencies, and supreme leaders. But the victims of this endless geopolitical chess match are the Iranian people.
The polling data and, frankly, the sheer scale of the recurring protests over the last decade indicate that a massive majority of the Iranian populace, up to 80%, does not support the current system.
80%.
You have this highly educated, historically rich, deeply vibrant culture of people who are essentially trapped in a time loop.
That's a great way to put it. For a century and a half, they were crushed by outside imperial powers exploiting their geography and their resources. Then, through immense sacrifice, they overthrew the puppet regime.
But the architects of that revolution, driven by the trauma of foreign interference, just built a paranoid, high-control domestic cage around them.
So they're caught in a vice grip once again. On one side, they face a domestic regime that views its own citizens as a potential vector for Western subversion, leading to severe crackdowns and terrible human rights abuses.
Right. And on the other side, they face foreign powers that continually utilize broad economic sanctions and coercion.
Tactics that overwhelmingly devastate the middle class rather than actually hurting the regime's elite.
So when you read the headlines today, whether it's about uranium enrichment levels, an IRGC proxy militia action in the Red Sea, or a new wave of protests led by women in the streets of Tehran, you are not just reading current events.
No, and you're not.
You are reading the latest manifestation of a 200-year-old operating system. The treaties of Golestan, the Darcy oil concession, the 1953 coup, the creation of SAVAK. This history is not in the past. It is actively functioning right now in the present.
It is the blueprint of the fortress.
Which leaves us with a final structural paradox for you to think about. Think back to that fortress we talked about at the beginning. The architect built those walls to withstand the empires of the outside world, the parallel militaries, the vetted elections, the proxies. It has all worked to prevent a foreign coup for over 40 years.
It has.
But if you engineer an entire state apparatus, specifically as an immune response to a foreign virus, what happens to that body when the foreign threat is no longer the most immediate danger?
What happens when the pressure reaching the absolute breaking point is coming from the millions of citizens trapped inside?
Can a fortress designed entirely to withstand a siege from the outside survive when the structural failure is happening from within?
That is the question of the century for Iran.
It really is. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the headlines, keep exploring the history behind them, and we will catch you next time.